every singer has a unique vocal sound and style. And I mean, scientifically, we're talking about everybody's voice is different. You have different vocal cords, you have a different resonation system, the muscles are slightly shaped differently, you have slightly different teeth than the person next to you. Everybody's voice is different. And since every genre has its own requirements in order to be able to sing that music really well, that means that there is a genre of music that is built for your specific voice, and possibly many genres. That's why it's so sad to me when I have singers that come in that just want to sing like Nick Jonas or Adele. And unfortunately, if your voice doesn't really fit with those artists, then it's possible that you may be doing something that's unhealthy in your voice. You may be manipulating your voice in ways that aren't going to be sustainable for you long term. So today we're going to find your vocal genre, so we know that it is a perfect fit for what you're going to sing. And by the way, your voice may fit many, many different genres. You may be able to sing pop, R&B, rock, lots of different things together that I may even identify as being quite different today. Conversely, you might find out that you've been singing in the wrong genre. Like maybe you're really built like a jazz singer, whereas, you've been singing rock this whole time. And I should also probably point out that for every guideline or rule or kind of convention of a musical genre that we look at today, there are probably 10 singers that break that mold and sound amazing doing it. So just understand that these are just general guidelines and conventions that we've established in hundreds of years of musical history. They are not rules that you have to blindly follow. In fact, some of the best music comes out when a singer does something that may fit one genre really well into a new genre. For instance, you could think of Elvis Presley's, signature kind of wavering vibrato with that low larynx, hey baby. And he was just trying to do his best impression of old blues singers that he listened to. So first, we'll talk about the elements that make up your unique vocal style. Then we'll talk about the requirements for the most popular genres of music and how you can find your own unique vocal genre fit. Now let's start off with the obvious. I mentioned earlier that there is a genetic component to singing that makes you completely unique. There are three main systems in singing. There's the respiration system that's made up of my lungs, diaphragm, etc. There's the phonation system, which is made up of my vocal cords inside of my larynx or inside of my voice box. And then there's the resonation system, which involves all of the vocal tract or all of the kind of things that are up above the vocal cords. That includes my pharynx, what my larynx is doing, my teeth, my tongue, all the articulators. Now, these are all genetic components that make you sound like you. And remember, you can train them, but you can't change them. This means that you have a unique vocal sound just by merit of you being born, just because your vocal cords are shaped in a certain way and all the resonating centers are completely unique to you. Next, let's talk about the unique vocal styles in each genre and how to make them your own. Now, I should point out I'm going to be speaking super generally today, and that's by necessity. There are like over 100 genres of just metal, so we can't possibly talk about them all today. So I'm going to be speaking very generally. But I think what you can say is that for each of the categories and the genres that we're going to be looking at today, I'm going to be identifying and grading them according to 4 different spectrums. The first spectrum is from energetic to calm. And I think that this one's pretty obvious, but when I'm talking about energetic versus calm, I'm not only talking about the dynamic or the volume that someone's singing at, but I'm also talking about, things like the ratio of how much chest voice and how much head voice they're using. By the way, if you're not familiar with those terms, chest voice and head voice, make sure to watch my video on mixed voice technique. Also, in the energetic to calm spectrum, we can talk about how much of the vocal cords are being used. Are we using the ventricular or the false vocal cords as well as the true vocal cords? You can even look at things like breath pressure. How much breath pressure is required to sing this music? Very, very important things to note. The second spectrum that we're going to be grading all of these genres on is from technical to intuitive. And what I mean by technical versus intuitive is how much technique is required in order to sing this music really well and passably, versus something that's more intuitive, which is just a little bit more from the gut, just kind of throw and go and just sing it as best as you can. For instance, if you're singing rock music, this is very, very intuitive music. Certainly, more techniques are going to help you sing it better. However, there's a long, long list of rock singers that never had a lesson in their life and maybe even sound better as a result of it. Whereas if you're singing pop music, this music tends to be a lot more technical and much more demanding on the voice. And as a result, it's very, very important to have technique down correct. The third spectrum that we're going to grade all of these vocal genres on is from emotional to intellectual. Now, let me just say right off the bat that all music is emotional, and this is probably the hardest one to grade, and we're gonna grade this one with a curve, because if we assume that all music is emotional, and lots of people bring their own experience to the music that they listen to. For instance, I might talk about folk music as being slightly more intellectually based than, let's say, rock music. However, people that play, write, and really love folk music would probably argue that it's very, very emotional. However, we're going to assume that all music is somewhat emotional, and we're going to just grade these on a spectrum. And the way that this impacts your performance is in more emotional music, typically that's going to impact how you're going to execute specific sounds. For instance, in more emotional music, you might have a higher emphasis on the dynamic or singing stronger. You also might focus more on the vowels that you're singing rather than trying to be understood and trying to get a point across like you might with more intellectual music where it's the lyric that really matters. And our final spectrum that we're going to be grading these genres on is from affected to authentic. And when I say affected, I mean how important is vocal affectation to singing this music really well. For instance, like if you were going to sing jazz music, jazz has a tremendous amount of vocal ornamentation and vocal affectations. You're changing the position of the larynx a lot. There's a lot of smooth and vibrato sung lines, whereas something that may be a little bit more authentic, like folk music, kind of, puts a higher emphasis on really seeming authentic and like singing in your own voice. Now, just to be clear, in all genres, you want to be singing in your own voice. And in general, the less affectation you're doing, oftentimes the better it turns out. However, we're talking about really, really small amounts of affectation and how important they are to sing that music passably. Okay, let's start off with where my heart is, which is with rock music. Now, rock music on the spectrum from energetic to calm, not surprisingly, this is super energetic music. There's gonna be a lot of loud volume, a lot of really, really strong vocals, and really, really emotional. On the scale from technical to intuitive, rock music is very, very intuitive. Oftentimes it sounds better to just sing a note with a lot of guts and a lot of might and a lot of power than it does to sing it perfectly. I already mentioned that rock music is certainly more emotional than it is intellectual, and that's not to take anything away from it. I think that rock music is really, really smart a lot of the time. However, you can actually take a look at the lyrics and see how often you're really not able to understand a whole lot about what the singer is saying. That's just a sign that it's more about putting an emphasis on the emotionality of the song, of what they're trying to express, than the lyrics itself. And finally, on the spectrum from authentic to affected, rock music is very, very heavily influenced toward the authentic side of things. There are tons and tons of exceptions to this, but in general, rock music favors the more authentic vocal sound of a singer's true voice than an overly trained voice. Next up is pop and electronic music. Between energetic and calm, I would say that pop music in general is somewhat energetic. It's definitely on the more energetic side of things. And oftentimes you'll see within a song how the dynamics or the volumes change just between a verse and a chorus. Oftentimes the choruses are really, really loud and very exciting, where the verses are very, very quiet and reserved. As I mentioned earlier, pop music is very, very technical. Oftentimes it's very, very difficult to sing, and as a result, it favors really good vocal technique. And what makes this interesting is pop music is also very emotional. So rather than it just being all about clever lyrics and being understood to sing exactly what you mean, pop music is oftentimes very on the emotional side of things. It favors a really, really strong position of the vowels rather than really strong position of the consonants. And finally, pop music is quite affected. Oftentimes there's an authentic vocal that goes along with it. However, there are so many times when you just can't sing a pop song right without raising your larynx up to the roof of your throat and making it sound really, really bright and All right, now we're moving into country music. Now, on the energy spectrum, country music is quite calm. Oftentimes, the dynamics are very even, sometimes even a little bit low, but again, it's more about what those words mean. Country music is also very intuitive. It is not super technical. Don't get me wrong, there are lots of great country singers out there that have loads of great vocal technique. However, more often, it's very, very likely to be singing country music in a much more intuitive fashion, where you're just kind of getting a very real sense of the way that it sounds. Now, between emotional and intellectual, I would rate country music right in the middle. Oftentimes, country music is very emotional, and it's trying to give you a very, very emotional story, oftentimes. However, there is usually a convention within country music to be singing very clever and witty lyrics and coming up with very creative rhymes. And that's why I'm going to put this one closer to the intellectual side. And finally, country music definitely favors a more authentic vocal sound. Overproduced vocals are not going to sound great here. It's more about being real and true to yourself. Next up is R&B and soul music. Now, R&B and soul music tends to be quite energetic. There's usually a lot of vocal power involved in it, and even though you could even kind of compare it to country in that it's oftentimes trying to tell a really emotional story, at the same time, there's just a ton of powerhouse vocals in there, and it's more important to kind of convey the feeling. Unlike its cousin, rock and roll, R&B and soul music is very, very technical. Oftentimes, the singing techniques that are required to sing it well are very, very intense, and you'll find that a lot of R&B singers have had a lot of training and a lot of experience singing. On the spectrum from emotional to intellectual, soul and R&B music is very, very firmly emotional. It's all about the emotion. Can I second that emotion? Finally, R&B and soul music is all about being authentic. It's all about singing with your own true voice from your own unique perspective. A ton of crazy vocal effects is not what's warranted here. It's more about being true to what the song wants. That doesn't mean that there aren't a lot of vocal acrobatics in soul and R&B music. There definitely are. However, it's always used to serve the song rather than to just show off. Next up is jazz music. On the spectrum of energy, jazz music is quite calm compared to rock and roll or maybe soul or R&B music. However, jazz music is not particularly intuitive. Oftentimes, the notes that a singer is asked to sing are somewhat contrary and tend to come with a lot of vocal training. For that reason, jazz is very technical. And unlike R&B and soul music, jazz music is also quite intellectual. Now, a lot of people might disagree with me on this because I think that in recent years, jazz has gotten this kind of perspective of being kind of like really rich, kind of sophisticated music.
Every one of these guys is composing, they're rearranging, they're writing, and they're playing the melody.
However, I'm going to just say that because of the technical prowess that's required to sing jazz correctly, there's a lot of intellectual thought that goes into the notes that are chosen and the words that are sung. And finally, on the spectrum from affected to authentic, jazz is very affected. Oftentimes, the singer is lowering their larynx, raising their larynx, spreading the vowel, narrowing the vowel to get different sounds that they want to. Next up, blues. Now, on the energy spectrum, blues music is kind of right in the middle, right between calmer and being more energetic. There's a lot of dynamic changes in blues music where oftentimes verses will be very quiet and build up to a big chorus, and especially will kind of like kind of snowball towards the end of the song, where the last part of the song is the most really rutsy, gutsy, and really the highest in volume and energy. Blues singing is usually very intuitive. There's not a whole lot of technique to it. Oftentimes, the singer is just singing just in chest voice. There's not a whole lot of mixing between the head and the chest voice going on, and as a result, it's way more important to just kind of sing it the way you feel it. This leads us to the obvious conclusion that blues is definitely more on the emotional side of music than the intellectual side of music. As I mentioned earlier, all music is emotional, but blues especially, it's named after an emotion. Just being blue, feeling depressed, feeling down, and singing the blues so you don't get them. And finally, blues music definitely favors a very authentic approach to singing. It's all about seeming as your true self and telling the story from your own perspective. Next up, classical music. Classical music, and especially opera, is definitely on the calmer side of the energy spectrum of music. It's an older form of music than most of the other ones that we've covered so far today, and as a result, it's not all about just the emotion. Certainly, emotionality is a huge part of all the types of music, and I can hear the hateful comments coming in right now. However, opera and classical music is about conveying this emotion very clearly, and oftentimes there's a storyline attached to it as well, which firmly puts it into the more calm side of the energy spectrum. Classical music is also very technical. Good luck being a beginning singer trying to sing opera or classical or art pieces for the first time. You are going to get your butt kicked. It is very difficult music to sing well, and as a result, usually takes years of vocal training in order to sing correctly. On the intellectual to emotional spectrum, classical music is also very intellectual. Oftentimes it's way more about conveying the storyline and the feelings of the singer than making you feel them. And finally, between affected and authentic vocal performance, classical music tends to favor the more affected vocal performance. Oftentimes there's a lot of really low larynx, very open throat kind of singing that goes along with it, all about conveying this beauty, this kind of sonorous singing sound. Next up, metal. Metal is very firmly in the energetic side of music. Can you imagine someone being very calm and emotionally stable that's just trying to sing this beautiful metal music? It's not going to work. Metal usually sounds better from people that are really wear their heart on their sleeve and have that emotion that's really raw and ready to rock. However, unlike rock music, metal is very technical music to sing, especially if you want to sing it without destroying your voice. Oftentimes with rock music being more intuitive, where you just kind of throw and go with your voice, metal music oftentimes requires some very specific techniques in order to sing, those death growls and screams correctly, and more importantly, to preserve your voice.
You use your diaphragm heavily to force air through, and you clench your throat really tight. And the way that it comes out is it's like a...
On the spectrum from emotional to intellectual, again, metal music is very emotional music, usually going straight for the feeling and trying to make you feel it as well. And finally, on the spectrum from affected to authentic, metal music is very affected. Oftentimes there's lots of growls, screams, lots of tricks, lots of vocal tricks are involved in order to convince the people out there that they're really feeling this emotion, that oh kind of sound is really cool to do, but it's very affected versus just saying ah. That wouldn't sell any records. Next up, folk music. I mentioned earlier that folk music in general is definitely on the calmer side of the energy spectrum. You can't really imagine a folk singer-songwriter just screaming at you. I mean, it happens, but it's a lot more rare. Folk music is also quite intuitive to sing. Usually it's not all about having the most perfect vocals, it's more about giving a really kind of authentic performance. Similar to country music, folk music is probably even closer to the extreme of the intellectual side. It's oftentimes really about a story, a history, or conveying a certain idea in the most beautiful and oftentimes witty and clever lyrics that you possibly can. For that reason, oftentimes articulating the words that you're saying is the most important thing. And finally, on the scale from authentic to affected, folk music is very, very authentic. In fact, if there's even a hint of doing something that's very, very affected, it will often rub the listener the wrong way, and they'll feel like they're, betrayed by something. Which you can even look at, Bob Dylan's history of when he went electric and changed his vocal style to go along with that. I mean, people thought he was a traitor. Our last stop on the vocal genres is going to be indie and alternative music. Now, indie and alternative music is a very, very embarrassingly wide category, and it's almost impossible to generalize it. But I would say, in general, this tends to be, especially alternative music, tends to be more on the energetic side of the energy spectrum. Indie and alternative music also tends to be very intuitive to sing. I often make the joke that if I was just trying to make my living working with the indie singers here in Austin, I would starve to death. Because they don't take lessons. It's all about, just turning up the reverb up to 12 and just, being within a mile of the note. It's no surprise then that indie and alternative music is also very emotional. It's not super intellectual, and oftentimes the lyrics take a backseat to the way that something is being sung. And finally, on the spectrum from authentic to affected, indie and alternative music really rewards very unique vocal performances, and those tend to be very affected. Uses of falsetto, singing with a high larynx, singing with an extra low larynx. Tame Impala, Bahamas, the song Budapest, for instance, he's singing with a low larynx the entire time. It's all about having the most unique vocal sound. That concludes our world tour of different vocal genres and the requirements for each one of them. But always remember, self-awareness is number one. Odds are you have a very unique voice that will fit one or more of these different genres that we've talked about today. But the goal is knowing your voice and being able to figure out which one will fit it best. Thanks so much for watching. If you guys found this video helpful, make sure to like, comment, subscribe, but most importantly, turn on that notification bell to get notified anytime I drop a new video just like this.